Hello, this is Restoration with Pastor Dennis Martin. I'm grateful that you've joined me on today. I know today's message and word is going to bless your life, so I need you to do me a favor. I need you to tag somebody. I need you to share this, forward it to somebody that they may hear today's message. So many of you have reached out to me and to Pastor Martin. We certainly enjoy what you've been sharing, and on many social media platforms, I'm hearing from many of you, and I'm grateful that you are tuning in. Today, I want to share with you concerning how to deal with history, And many of us, we must understand that we're dealing with a lot of things today in the church and even outside of the church, and we're dealing with history. Most of us, when we were in school, took history, and they would teach us things that happened before we got here and brought us up to speed on things that were taking place and things that we needed to know. Some of us, we failed history. Some of us, we didn't like history, but history is so valuable and it's so important, and we must remember our history, and we must know how to deal with history. You know, as I thought about this and as the Lord began to deal with me about this, he said, one of the things that has been one of the greatest failures, I believe, not only in our day dealing with this generation. We talk about millennials, we talk about generation XYZ, we talk about baby boomers, we talk about all of those, but we must remember that every generation has its own time. But one of the things that God did commission in the Old Testament was no matter what generation it was, he left it to those that were before to pass on the history and to teach them those that were coming after them. And so they were instructed and encouraged to teach history, to share his words, to share where they had came from. When I looked at this and I began to read, and I'll give you scripture reference to this in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9 through 11, he begins to tell them, I need you to bring those in. I'm going to share some words with you, and I need you to share it with your children. Matter of fact, it is found in Deuteronomy chapter 4, and you'll find it there at verse 10, where he says to them, and that they may teach their children, He says, I want you to be able to teach your children. They need to know these things I'm sharing. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 through 12, and I'll read at verse 7, he said, thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou layest down, and when thou risest up. He said, I need you to understand every opportunity you get with your children. I need you to teach them these words. I need you to share with them where they've come from. I need you to share with them, teach them how to love me, and teach them things. I need you, he says, it goes on further, and he says, I need you to tell them that what they're enjoying, they must understand that this was the promise that I gave to the fathers. I swear unto their fathers, Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them great and goodly cities which thou buildest not, and houses full of good things which thou fillest not, and wells which you didn't dig, and vineyards which you didn't plant, and olive trees which you didn't plant. He said, and when thou have eaten and are full, he gave one warning, beware, lest thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And so he teaches us even again in Deuteronomy chapter 11 and verse 18 through 21. And at verse 19, he says, you shall teach them to your children, speak of them when you're sitting in the house, when you're walking by the way, when thou liest down. And so he tells us that one of the things that he's commanded us to do, that he did to them, he said, you must teach them. And one of the great failures of dealing with history, and where we have not dealt with history properly, is to teach. It's a failure on our part when we do not teach history to our children and to the generation that come behind us. Some things they will never know unless we sit down and share the history with them. There are many of my relatives that I had never met, but my grandmother that raised me would sit me down and she would call names and tell me, if you ever hear this name, you probably kin to them. And then she would say, that's your cousin. This is your cousin. And she would teach me and share the history of our family. We must share history with those that are coming behind us, so we won't fail that generation that follows us. Then the generation that follows us must understand that you cannot fail by failing to learn history. You've got to settle yourself, sit down and learn some history. You need to know where you come from. You need to know what you're enjoying. You need to know the benefits of what's happening for you today. You need to know how you got it. You need to know how you got it, why you got it, and who paid the price for you to get it. Some stuff that you have, somebody paid for you to get it. You must understand, some of us that are enjoying the liberties that we're enjoying them at the sacrifice of somebody else. In other words, somebody sacrificed for us to enjoy the liberties that we have. When you think of Rosa Parks that refused to give up her seat, that was something, because she refused to give up her seat. That meant that we have the liberty to enjoy a bus ride and ride in any place on the bus we want to. That was because of her sacrifice that we're enjoying that liberty. There are many that sit in on food counters that were not allowed to do so back in the day, but they were sacrificing themselves, looking toward the future. And so therefore we're enjoying the liberties of their sacrifice. Their sacrifice brought us to where we are, and we're enjoying that sacrifice. And so we never want to forget. Sometimes I hear, as I've gotten older, my mindset has changed a whole lot. You know, when I was 18 and 19, I thought when you were 40 and 50 and 60 years old, you were old. But now that I've gotten past 50, I understand, and I start looking at things a little bit differently, because I understand of the sacrifices that our foreparents made, our mothers, our fathers, and some made for us. We laugh and we may have been embarrassed when your aunt or your mother or someone was cleaning the house for someone, where they were making sacrifices so we could enjoy school and college and different things. And so that sacrifice was made. And now we have a liberty and a freedom that we got because somebody paid a price for it, and there was a sacrifice made. And so we must deal with history properly. Then we deal with history. I want to say to us that when we pass the baton, we must pass it with history. We must pass it along with history. I used to run track. I used to run 440 relays. I used to run those things where they would pass the baton to us and we would make the exchange at a certain time. And so every generation makes an exchange. We give to someone else, or we pass it on to someone else. As we move off the scene, we start passing things on. Well, understand that when we pass it on, we've got to pass it on with history, so they'll understand that when they get it, this is not something I'm just giving to you. This is something that I'm passing along, and this is the history of what I'm passing on to you, so you'll know what the value of it is and how it is something that you need to know. Then we must understand, for people who don't know where they came from, sometimes don't value where they're going. If you don't know where you come from, sometimes you don't value where you're going. Thank God, if you know where you come from, then you'll know, we're on our way somewhere, but we value that we had a starting point, and we value history. And so we're going to deal with history right. We're going to deal with history the proper way. I want to tell you, all history is not bad. Even that you think is bad is not bad. We need to know. We need to know how to deal with history, whether you're young, whether you're old. One of the things that I valued as a young man was to sit down and to listen. I mean, actually listen to those that had come before me, so I would have a better understanding of what to do and how to do. Even with the new things, I wanted to hear. I used to sit at the side and at the bedside of my grandmother and listen to her talk about the history of our family. I used to sit and listen at my uncle talk about how he came through evangelism and being an evangelist and growing up and ministering in the 60s when there was segregation and he was not allowed to stay in hotels and he had to sleep in the car. Oh, I know his great legacy. I know his fame that he had, but no one really knew his story and his history. And I wanted to know that so I'll be able to value and also to appreciate the history. I used to take 3 days every year and go to Memphis to just sit down and just pick and talk with Bishop G.E. Patterson and pick his brain on history. And he would share with me some of the things when he was a young evangelist and when he used to preach for people like Bishop F.D. Washington in New York at Washington Temple and different things, and just pick his brain so I would understand history and I could appreciate what they did to bring us to where we are today. And I want to say to you, we've got to deal with history just a little bit better. We must learn that it is history. And I know somebody saying, I ain't gonna get caught up in history because I got to go further. But if you don't have a starting point, sometimes you don't know where you're going. And sometimes history helps you to stay focused. It helps you to focus on where you really need to be going and not just going somewhere where you don't need to go. And then history would tell you, because God said it, when you get where you're going, when you get stuff that you didn't build, when you get stuff that you got that you didn't build yourself, but I gave it to you. He said, what I want you to do, I just got one thing I want to tell you. One thing. And that one thing is, beware lest thou forget the Lord thy God. The question is, how are you going to deal with history?